Hi everybody, and welcome to another episode of Scale Modeling with Mike Ashey. This evening we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to do an aircraft construction techniques tutorial, part 1 and part 2. This is part 1. I broke them into two parts because the total is about over 30 minutes because I've got a lot of slides that I've converted to video. So let's get started with aircraft construction techniques, part 1.
When you are ready to start removing parts from their trees, use either a plastic cutter or a pair of snippers and mark the parts with their numbers with an indelible marker. Always cut parts off their trees, leaving some of the tree stub on the part. The stubs can then be easily clipped off without damaging the part's surface. If the tree stubs are flush with the part's gluing surface, you can slice them off with a number 11 X-Acto blade. Here's an example of cutting parts off their trees. In some cases, the stubs are so small you can use snippers to remove the part from the tree. Here I'm using a wood block to cut the remaining stub off the part. Snippers were used to cut this radial engine part from its tree. The snippers can now be positioned parallel to the push rods and the remaining stubs cut off. To prevent damage to a part's surface, slice off the tree stub using a sharp number 11 X-Acto blade. I like to use sanding sticks to smooth out the plastic and polish it after removing the stub. Always check the gluing surfaces to be sure they're flat. Sometimes the surface imperfections are obvious, and sometimes the surface imperfections are very subtle and very hard to see. You can use a sharp number 11 X-Acto blade to scrape the surfaces smooth. Or you can use a sanding stick, or a combination of both. You can also run parts across a stationary piece of sandpaper to smooth out the gluing surface. And you can get a much tighter fit of part halves by sanding both surfaces smooth. Resin parts should be marked where their pour blocks are. Thick pour blocks can be removed with a razor saw. And to control the resin dust, wet sand off any remaining pour plugs from the resin parts and always wear a mask when cutting or sanding resin. Some resin pour blocks are thin and they can be removed with cutters. And sometimes you can score the edge of a resin pour block with a sharp number 11 X-Acto blade and then snap it off. On circular resin parts, make tangential cuts around the part to remove the excess resin. Sometimes you will need to elevate a resin pour block to remove parts without damaging them. Some resin kits have holes in them where air pockets were inside the mold. Drill them out and superglue a corresponding diameter length of plastic rod into the hole, trim it, and then carefully wet sand it smooth. After removing all the major parts, cleaning them up and marking them, I do a test fit of all the major parts, which I call a tape-up. Even small assemblies like engines should be taped together to check their fit. When engines connect to other assemblies, all the sub-assemblies should be taped together to check the fit. Here's another example of a sub-assembly engine tape-up. The tape-up allows you to check how all the sub-assembly parts fit together, how the sub-assemblies fit together with each other, and how everything fits inside the fuselage. This is the time to fix individual part or sub-assembly issues. The tape-up of this 1/32 scale P-47D revealed issues with the landing gear bays and the wing-to-fuselage connection surfaces. Taping up the P-47 cowling and attaching it to the fuselage revealed a step at the bottom area between the parts that needed to be corrected. Checking the fit of the windscreen revealed a gap that also needed to be fixed. All the cockpit parts should also be test fitted to be sure everything fits correctly inside the fuselage. The tape-up also allows you to identify voids, and it gives you time to think about how to correct them before you start assembling, detailing, and painting your model. The tape-up also allows you to identify areas where interior reinforcement is needed to strengthen gluing points, so seams will not crack. The tape-up is especially helpful on older kits like this Monogram B26 Marauder, where the tape-up identified these large gaps on the upper cowling halves. And this wing to fuselage misalignment. And the elevator connection with the fuselage, all of which need to be corrected. Use the kit's instructions to make notes on the issues and challenges that you found. The tape-up also gets you thinking about the details you want to add and checking the fit of photo etch and resin accessories. Most importantly, it gets you thinking about the assembly sequence you will need to implement, taking into consideration your fixes to identified issues, the addition of detail sets, and your painting and finishing efforts. All the one-piece parts will have very subtle mold lines which will need to be scraped off and removed. I like to use my trusty number 11 X-Acto blade to peel off these mold lines. And for lighter colored plastic, prime the parts first so that you can easily see these mold lines. Sometimes mold punch-outs are in very hard to fix places. And in these cases, I like to use my Northwest Shortline chopper to make covers for these mold punch-outs. The plastic is only 0.015 inches thick, and once the part is primed and painted, you won't notice the additional plastic. This is an easy way to correct these types of problems. Here's another example of hiding mold punch-outs on this 1/32 scale Dauntless SBD. These mold punch-outs were indented, so I used my trusty Waldron punch tool to make discs to fill the holes. The discs were superglued into place and then wet sanded smooth. The surfaces will then be detailed with a photo etch set. The indented mold punch-outs on these 1/32 scale landing gear were drilled out, plastic rod superglued into place, and then the rod was trimmed and sanded smooth with a flexifile. These mold punch-outs were raised, and I was able to wet sand them smooth with sandpaper wrapped around lengths of balsa wood of various thicknesses. Surface dimples can sometimes be drilled out and filled with plastic rod, and sometimes you have to use putty to fill them in, and then carefully sand the surfaces smooth. I always reinforce the insides of my aircraft models to add strength to the wings and the fuselage. This is especially helpful on newer kits, as they have thinner plastic which can easily flex, cracking a seam. When you are going to have to add weight to get your model to sit on its landing gear correctly, reinforcing the wings and the fuselage prevents seams from cracking and splitting. The wings on this Monogram 1/48 scale Marauder will be supporting a lot of weight. Note how thick the plastic strips are that were laminated to the inside of the wings. Sometimes you have to mark the locations of reinforcing strips so they won't interfere with sub-assemblies. These strips were all laminated with superglue. Note how long the strips are so that placement and positioning would be easy. And the added strips were then carefully trimmed. Wherever possible, also reinforce glued seams. The larger sections of plastic noted by the arrows are for added depth to the exhaust ports when they get drilled deeper. Always cut photo etch parts on a glass or plexiglass plate using a sharp blade. Photo etch box shapes should be reinforced to add strength to the assembly, and you should also add tiny plastic strips along the inside edges to increase the area of the gluing surface. Note how these photo etch parts are reinforced with both sheet, strip, and shaped plastic lengths. They're for the monogram 1/48 scale B26 Marauder. The gluing edges of photo etch parts were also increased to add strength to each attachment point. And photo etch bulkheads are flexible, so laminate them with plastic sheeting with superglue to add strength. Photo etch parts are sometimes not an exact fit, so hide the gaps with tiny strips of plastic. Pre-painted photo etch parts that have multiple layers are best glued together by keeping the lower part attached to its tree and gluing the upper part in place. On small photo etch seatbelts, fold and glue the buckles into place prior to removing these parts. Self-adhesive photo etch parts should be cut out and shaped with the paper backing still attached. To facilitate the positioning of adjustment buckles on pre-painted seatbelts, carefully bend the belt where you want the buckle to be located, carefully slide it into place, and then press it flat. Hi everybody, these are my scale model axioms. I won't read them to you, but you should take them to heart. Scale modeling is a three-dimensional assembly hobby that allows you to be creative as you want to be. Always remember to have fun, explore new ways to do things, experiment, and share what you have learned. And above all, ignore the accuracy hounds and the perfectionists. Many of them have never even seen an old aircraft up close, and they would never acknowledge that most World War II aircraft had lap joint surfaces, which are best represented by the raised panel lines and rivets you find on older aircraft kits.
Hi everybody. I hope you enjoyed part one of aircraft construction techniques. I know that was a lot to take in, and I try to stretch the video out so you can really absorb some of the techniques that I use to build my model aircraft. And I hope you enjoyed my axioms. So stay tuned for aircraft construction techniques part 2.